Every January, the same miracle occurs. Overnight, it seems like our city becomes the healthiest place on earth. Have you ever noticed that? And gyms are packed. In my neighborhood, people are out walking like crazy. You know, you drive by various gyms and the parking lots are full to overflowing. People are walking around with brand new shoes, brand new water bottles, and expressions that say, this time it's different. This time it's going to be different. And treadmills that haven't been touched since Easter are dusted off, the clothes are removed, and they're fired up and actually used. Salads are photographed and put on social media. Apps are downloaded to keep up with your exercising and your eating and how much water you drink. Alarm clocks are set with heroic optimism. Are they not? And for about 3 weeks, it seems like humanity has finally figured it out. They finally figured everything out. Then February arrives quietly, like a thief in the night. Gym attendance drops. Those new shoes, they migrate to the back of the closet. Resolutions don't explode. They just kind of fade out, fade away, and disappear. And the funny thing is, none of this really surprises us, does it? That's what we're used to happening. It's what we see happening all the time. And we've all been there, and some of us are there right now. Mike, Mr. Soundman, could you turn down the monitors with my mic? They seem to be extremely loud, and we're getting feedback. Now, this raises an uncomfortable question we don't usually stop to ask. If we want to change so badly, if we want to be different, if we want to be better, and if we genuinely mean it when we make resolutions, then why don't we change? Why don't we change? We want it. We mean it. We resolve to do this. Then why don't we change? Why does our determination wear out so quickly? Where does our resolve actually go? Why do the same frustrations, the same habits, the same inner tensions seem to just keep walking right alongside of us no matter what we do? Even in a brand new year with a blank slate and a new opportunity. And maybe the problem isn't effort. Maybe the problem is not resolve. Maybe the problem isn't determination. Maybe the problem isn't sincerity. Maybe the problem is that real change doesn't come from turning the page on a calendar. Do you think that's the problem? There's nothing inherently magical about turning the pages, sir. There's not. Maybe real change comes from something deeper. And Scripture has a lot to say about where that kind of change actually begins. And if you have your Bibles, let's look at it this morning. We're going to be Psalm 37 and start in verse 1. Fret not yourself because of evildoers, and be not envious of wrongdoers, for they will soon fade like the grass and wither like the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and befriend faithfulness. Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in Him, and He will act. He will bring forth your righteousness as delight, and your justice as the noonday. Be still before the Lord, and wait patiently for Him. Fret not yourself over the one who prospers in his way, over the man who carries out evil devices. Refrain from anger and forsake wrath. Fret not yourself, it tends only to evil, for the evildoers shall be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord shall inherit the land. In just a little while the wicked will be no more. Though you look carefully at his place, he will not be there. But the meek shall inherit the land and delight themselves in abundant peace. Psalm 37 is a wisdom psalm. Wisdom in Hebrew means skill for living life well. It's a skill we need to make the most out of life. That's what wisdom is. And this is a wisdom psalm. It's not written for a moment of crisis or a moment of national peril, but it is written for wisdom. Wisdom, especially when life feels unrewarded, when injustice seems to win and kind of have the high ground in your life. It speaks to people who are doing their best to live and follow God faithfully while watching other people prosper unfairly. We might all have a little taste of that right now. I've been thinking I just should have opened a Somali daycare most of the last couple of weeks. And, what am I doing going to work? So we may all have a sense, a way to connect with this psalm and what it's saying. And it warns us to be careful of, paying too much attention to other people. It warns that when we do, that something dangerous creeps into our lives. We give space for something that we don't need there. It's not open rebellion, but it's a heart that begins to smolder with envy and anger. And rather than calling God's people to strive harder or to do more, or react more forcefully, this psalm does something else. It teaches a different way of living, a different way of approaching our lives, if you will. And through a series of steady commands that I read through in the psalm, trust, delight, commit, surrender, it trains your heart to place its weight upon the Lord, not on your circumstances, not on the circumstances of other people or appearances or anything like it. So the message of Psalm 37 is simple, but it's searching. It teaches that wicked people are temporary, but those who entrust their way to the Lord, they learn composure, stability, and peace that endures forever. So stride forward with composure into this new year in order to, number one, guard against a smoldering heart. You want to walk with composure so you'll protect yourself from a smoldering heart. So David opens with a command that's far more serious than it sounds in English. If you'll look at verse 1 again, it says, "Fret not yourself because of evildoers. Be not envious of evildoers." The word fret here, it means a little more than passing irritation. The base meaning of the Hebrew word describes smoldering coals. It's describing heat. It's describing flame and fire. And so the way this word's used here is talking about that inner heat in your heart. It's the heart running hot. It's starting to cook under the surface. A slow burn that comes from comparison between your life and the lives of other people. And when you do that, you're just going to know some resentment, because I promise you, someone somewhere is living a better life than you. Right? And if you're on social media all the time, all you see is a long stream of everybody posting their best moments on there. Like, well, I didn't have any best moments today or this week or the last month. What's the deal? Why does everybody have a better life than me? Well, that's not true. That's not true. So David is warning us that one of the most dangerous spiritual conditions, it's not open rebellion, but it's a heart that begins to smolder. It begins to smolder while it watches the wicked prosper. And then David shows us why this matters in verse 8. He says, "Refrain from anger and forsake wrath. Fret not yourself. It tends only to evil." So a smoldering heart never stays contained. It spreads. It moves from envy to anger, from anger to wrath. If it's not checked, it's eventually going to lead you into evil. And that's kind of how it is when you let something just keep on cooking away, isn't it? I like to call it like the crock pot syndrome a lot of people have. What happens if you put a bunch of stuff in a crock pot and plug it in and just leave it forever? Anybody know? Has anybody ever done that? You ever left it too long, somehow the lid comes off and stuff goes all over your countertop? You ever done that? You know, eventually that stuff smoldering away inside, it's going to work its way out. It does. I've seen it. Hey, guess what? I've had it happen to me. Maybe you've had it happen to you, right? And so eventually you're going to get into some trouble. And I think that's why Psalm 37 begins right here with our hearts. You know, before you can commit your steps to the Lord, before you can even think about striding forward with composure, you have to recognize what's trying to guide your steps. If your heart is burning, if your emotions are guiding your path, if you let emotions take the lead, they are going to offer you dangerous guidance. Dangerous guidance. So the first call of this psalm is to put that fire out before it takes you somewhere you never, ever meant to go. Now, the first place Psalm 37 presses us is not about our outward behavior. A lot of times wisdom psalms do this, but here it's about an inward awareness of what's going on inside of us. Most of us don't think of ourselves as angry or rebellious people. We don't think of ourselves like that. I don't think I'm an angry person, but we do recognize that slow burn of frustration that comes from watching others, seem to advance while we struggle, or seeing outcomes in our own lives that we don't have any control over at all. And so this psalm, it invites us to pay attention to that inner heat that's going on in our hearts. When irritation or resentment begins to simmer, when it starts to really cook, this psalm invites us to not ignore it and not to justify it. It tells us to guard against it, that it's a danger. And we got to watch out for it. If we don't, our emotions are going to take control. They're going to lead us. And when we begin making decisions, we begin reacting to people, when we begin interpreting events through a heart that is already overheated, we're going to make bad decisions. We're going to make unwise choices. And practically, this means learning to name what's happening inside of us before, we let things get really bad. When we feel that internal pressure rising, we feel like we're starting to heat up inside. Well, Psalm 37 gives us permission to stop and say, this isn't guidance. This isn't something we should be listening to. This isn't something that should be driving us in our lives. Feelings can be powerful, but they are unreliable leaders. Unreliable leaders. If we allow a smoldering heart to direct our steps, we're going to be pulled towards anger and impatience and irritation and choices that we never intended to make and never would have made. The wisdom of this psalm calls us to interrupt that process early, to cool our hearts before we really go into that direction. To refuse to stride into a new season led by frustration is something all of us should want in our lives. And that's the first step to walking forward with composure instead of being driven by emotion. We have to get our hearts under control. I once knew a man who made a major life decision when he was hungry, irritated, angry, and convinced that he was being disrespected. Have you ever made a decision when you were really angry? Anybody ever done it? Was it a good decision? Yeah, people don't want to say. I've never made a good decision when I'm angry, and I'm not going to tell any of my stories anymore, but that combination I mentioned, angry, hungry, feeling disrespected, being tired, that's a dangerous combination. It should be listed on the warning label for adulthood, where, we'll try to be more careful. He had a long day at work, a short conversation that rubbed him the wrong way not long before he left, and he drove home And the whole time he was writing imaginary speeches on what he wanted to say and what he should have said and how he's going to tell that person off and on and on and on. And by the time he pulled into his driveway after fighting through traffic that didn't make things any better, his heart was running hot and his emotions had already drafted the plan. So he wrote an email. And he sent the email. Not later, not tomorrow, not after sleeping on it or thinking about it right then. He typed fast. He reread nothing and hit send with the confidence of a man who I'm sure felt completely justified because that's what his heart had led him to do. The next morning, well rested, with a full stomach and a cooler heart, he had a reply sitting in his inbox. And he realized something important. His emotions had been terrible guides. They had promised relief and instead had delivered embarrassment. And he was going to have some consequences for it. And they had felt urgent at the time, but proven to be completely foolish. And looking back, he didn't think, I wish I had said that better. He thought, I wish I had slowed down. I wish I had thought things through. I wish I had waited. I wish I had prayed. In other words, he wished that he had followed the Lord instead of following his smoldering heart. And most of us, we don't need that story explained because we've lived some version of it ourselves, haven't we? Stride forward with composure in order to guard against a smoldering heart. And number 2, commit your steps to the Lord. After warning us about a smoldering heart, David turns to the positive reorientation of life here. In verse 3, he starts telling us, don't fret, don't trust your smoldering heart. Instead, in verse 3, he says, trust in the Lord and do good, dwell in the land and befriend faithfulness. Trust here in the Lord is not a passive kind of belief. That's not what he's talking about. It's not optimism. He's not talking about outcomes. This is reliance, a settled reliance upon the Lord, where you're going to trust him with all aspects of your life. No matter what's going on, you're going to trust him, right? You are going to trust him. You're going to trust the Lord instead of your instincts, instead of your emotions. And that trust reshapes how you approach life and how you go through your day. It leads you to steady obedience and kind of a settled kind of presence instead of frantic course correction. I feel like that's what a lot of people are living in. They have this repeated frantic course correction in life. They go from one mess to another, and they fix this one and they fix another, and they have this disaster and they get through that and they have another one, and just constantly trying to do these course corrections. Then in verse 4, David says, delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Do you see that? Delight moves trust beyond mere stability. It reorders desire itself in our lives. And when the Lord, when he becomes the source of our delight, the source of our joy, that means the heart slowly kind of loses its grip on outcomes, on emotions, and vindication. And that progression reaches its decisive moment here in verse 5. David says, commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him and he will act. He already told you to trust him once. He tells you again, and commit your steps to him. To commit isn't simply to agree with the Lord or to intend to do something. It's to hand over direction, to give over control. It would be like giving someone the remote control in your house. You want to know who has the power in your house? Look who has the remote control. I ran into a woman one time from church in a grocery store, and I could see right on the top of her purse she had a remote control. I said, what are you doing with that? She said, well, my husband and I kind of got into it, and I knew I was going to the store, so I took the remote control because I figured it was the meanest thing I could do to him this afternoon. See, as a bonus, wasn't even in my notes here this morning. It probably doesn't advance the sermon, but anyway, that's how it goes. Notice what follows when you give over this sense of control to the Lord. You see what he says? He says, he will act. Commit your steps to the Lord, trust him, he will act. The psalmist doesn't say how he's going to act, when he's going to act, in what manner he's going to act, but it promises us that he will act. That's what's going to happen. And that's kind of the turning point of the psalm here. The heart's no longer burning. Instead, it has surrendered to the Lord. It's committed itself to the Lord. Desire is no longer in the driver's seat. Something else has replaced it. Direction for your life, that's been given into the Lord's hands. And so, as a result, composure begins to emerge in your daily life. Not because you're trying to be composed. It's because the burden of steering your life by your emotions has been released. And instead, you're going to let the Lord do the driving. You're going to let him have the remote control. Psalm 37 presses us here because most of us trust the Lord emotionally, I would say, and we don't allow him to steer our path. Not really. You know? Emotionally, yeah, we trust the Lord, but we kind of make our own decisions how we want to. Because we don't only trust the Lord emotionally, we make decisions emotionally. We base everything off of our emotions. You know, we pray, we believe, and then we grab hold of the wheel and do what we want to do and go where we want to go. Now, to commit your way to the Lord, as the psalmist says, it means more than asking God to simply bless your plans. It means more than that. It means transferring control and direction itself. It's choosing to stop carrying on your shoulders the weight of outcomes and timelines and control, and deliberately giving those things into the Lord's hands. So many things in life are beyond our control. But they are not beyond the Lord's control. And that's why he needs to be driving. And this is where many of us struggle, because committing our steps, committing our decisions, committing everything to the Lord, well, that feels risky. It feels risky. It requires us to move forward without constant emotional reassurance or immediate results. But Psalm 37, it says that this is where real change begins. When we trust in the Lord and we commit our way to him. It's not from trying harder, resolving more firmly, or turning the page in a calendar. You know, as long as we keep directing our lives by urgency and fear or frustration, we're going to remain unsettled. We're not going to have the best outcomes. When we finally commit our steps to the Lord, not just our feelings, but our future, well then something happens, something shifts. We're no longer driven by what feels urgent. We're steadied by one who is faithful, one who loves us, one who knows the future and has all control. And that's how a person learns to stride forward with composure instead of control. Lindsay worked in an office where words traveled faster and grace didn't always keep up, right? One afternoon she found out that a coworker had said some things about her that were not entirely true and were extremely hurtful. And in the past, Lizzie knew exactly how she would have handled it. She would have defended herself, matched the coworker tone for tone, got as loud and nasty as she needed to, and made sure everyone in the office heard what went down. Her emotions would have taken the lead, and she would have followed them without hesitation wherever they wanted to go. But Lizzie was a fairly new believer. She had been going to church for a few months and had been reading her Bible, trying to understand it. And, a few days ago, she had read something in her Bible that she couldn't shake. Something about blessing those who curse you. And so instead of reacting, She went home and she prayed for that person. She prayed for herself, not once, but over the course of several days, she asked God for strength to forgive the person and for wisdom to know how to respond, when she talked to her. When she finally did go to her coworker, there was no speech that was prepared. There was no loud, fiery confrontation. She simply said, "What you said about me wasn't true, and it really hurt me." And the coworker paused, apologized, and then asked, Can you forgive me? And Lizzie said, "I already have." And as she walked back to her desk, Lizzie realized how different that moment felt. Nothing dramatic had changed, but everything inside of her had changed. The way she approached her life, the way she understood life, all of that somehow had changed, and everything inside of her head was different. And this time, her emotions hadn't driven the encounter. The Lord had. The Lord had directed her steps, and she knew, almost by surprise, that this is what it looks like when you commit your steps to the Lord. This is how life is. Not waiting until the feelings are settled, but instead choosing obedience. Choosing obedience to the Lord. And somehow when that happens, you discover composure along the way. Stride forward with composure in order to guard against a smoldering heart. Commit your steps to the Lord. And then finally, number 3, stride forward with composure in order to know abundant peace in your life. I don't know about you, but I would like to have more peace in my life, would you? I think all of us would like to have more peace in our lives. David brings this psalm to its quiet climax here in verse 11 when he says, "The meek shall inherit the land and delight themselves in abundant peace." The word translated meek here has really suffered in English. Like nobody seems to understand what the word meek actually means. In modern English, it sounds weak. It sounds passive. Being meek sounds easily overrun. But that's not the picture here. What David is describing is not timidity, but composure. But composure. These are people whose inner heat, like those smoldering hearts, have been brought under control and cooled. These are people who have committed their steps to the Lord, and they trust Him and follow His guidance instead of those smoldering hearts. Their strength has not disappeared. Instead, it has been governed by the way of the Lord. And meekness here is strength no longer driven by reaction. You're not letting reactions and emotion drive it. It's the settled posture of an inner life that's no longer scrabbling for control because you've given that control over to God. He directs your steps, not you. And so when David says they inherit the land, he's not simply talking about geography. He's describing a life that's marked by stability, safety, rest. The land where they would dwell, the promised land. It was a metaphor a lot of times for real peace in your life because the Hebrew people spent 40 years wandering around in a dangerous wilderness, having battles and fights. They just had enough to eat, nothing else, nowhere to lay their head. So they didn't truly know peace and safety until they got to the land, right? So to inherit the land is to dwell without fear, without living, threatened all the time. It's to move through life without constantly bracing for impact. And I feel like that's what so many people are doing today. They are just bracing for impact. And that's why these composed people could delight themselves in abundant peace, as David says. It's not a fragile calm. It's not a circumstantial quiet. That's not what he's talking about. It's a peace that overflows. It's a peace that fills the margins and the cracks in your life. It's peace that remains even when the world seems unsettled and anything but peaceful. This peace is the fruit of the Psalm's progression that it describes. Trust in the Lord cools the heart. Delight in the Lord, it reshapes desire. Commitment, it transfers direction. And what emerges is composure in our daily lives. And that composure, the bonus here, if you paid attention to verse 11, is a steady joy that pervades our lives. You have joy. You don't just have peace. You have delight. This delight in the Lord himself. So Psalm 37 doesn't promise a life without conflict, a life without problems. It promises a heart, a soul, a life that is no longer ruled by it. No longer ruled by it. This is the peace that comes not from getting your way right, but from giving your way to the Lord and committing your steps to him. Psalm 37 invites us to see peace not as something we chase, but something we arrive at. Peace is a destination we get to. And this only happens when our lives are rightly ordered, when they're lived in the right way, in the way that follows God's design in the Bible. Most of us, if we're honest, we spend our days wandering emotionally, reacting to pressure, bracing for a conflict of various kinds, of moving through life as if we are always exposed and we're always vulnerable. In this psalm, it calls us to something better, a better way of living. Composure is not a personality trait that's just reserved for a select few. Peace is not a reward simply for getting life right. They are the fruit of a life that is surrendered to God. When you commit your way to him, when we stop letting urgency and fear and desire drive us in our lives and instead commit our steps to the Lord, we begin to dwell rather than wander. You start dwelling with the Lord instead of wandering away from him. Life may still be difficult because life in this fallen world is difficult. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. But it no longer feels dangerous at every turn. That's what it means to inherit the land, to live steady, to walk unthreatened, to delight even now in a peace that does not depend upon our circumstances, but on the faithful hand of God. Years ago, I moved from Medill to Broken Bow. I'd grown up in Oak City, went to school in Shawnee, lived in Medill. I never really lived in eastern Oklahoma, true eastern Oklahoma, where you have hills and trees and backwoods people. I'd never been there. But I moved there, and a few weeks after I moved there, I went on what was supposed to be a simple float trip. Not a big deal. I was new to the area, unfamiliar with the river and the geography, and I made a decision that I learned, this one day never to make again. I wouldn't make it today. I didn't plan the trip. I trusted someone else to plan the trip. Someone else to handle the details. They were older, wiser, had lived there for 20 years. I trusted them to make good decisions. And he assured me we're going to make a short run, about 4 miles on the river, something we could take slowly. And we parked a car at the exit point, drove back to the launch, pushed off. And for the first few hours, everything was great. We lazily floated down the river, fishing along the way. About a mile before the exit, we pulled over and cleaned the fish and cooked them there on the riverside and ate them. It was a glorious day. We got back in, and like I said, it's supposed to be about an hour till we would get out. But we kept going and going and going and going, and what I thought was the last mile turned into many, many, many more. By the time the sun began to drop, it came clear that we were nowhere near the end of this route where we had parked, and the trip wasn't 4 miles. it was closer to 20. They actually had a package where you could do an overnight float trip and pay for it that was 21 miles. But hey, we did a 20-mile one. I paddled until my arms burned. I was sunburned, exhausted, more than a little angry. More than a little angry at that point, both at the situation, but largely at myself for trusting someone else that I shouldn't have trusted, right? The last stretch was the very worst of it. Darkness settled in, a storm had moved through, and for the final half hour, we were cold, wet, and I was genuinely unsettled, wondering, was I ever going to get off this river? It stopped being inconvenient. Started being unsafe. Eventually, very late, we reached the exit point, and I finally made it home. And before cell phones, I remember Libby was quite unhappy with me that I'd been gone so much longer than I'd said. I still, though, remember stepping inside of my house that night. Dry, sheltered, still, safe. The storm was over. But more than that, my wandering was done. I was back home. And the house felt like peace and safety in a way that I hadn't appreciated before. And it struck me afterward how much different that day would have been if I'd known where I was going. Or if I had paid closer attention to the path that I was trusting. And that experience stayed with me, not because rivers are dangerous, but because wandering always is. It is. And there's a deep difference between moving through life exposed and uncertain and dwelling in a place of rest. That difference is what Psalm 37 calls peace. Peace. A new calendar doesn't guarantee a new beginning. You know, January can turn a page, but it cannot change a heart. It cannot do it. It cannot do it. Psalm 37 reminds us that real change, it doesn't come from trying harder. It doesn't come from fresh intentions. It doesn't come from renewed effort, but from a surrendered way. When we trust the Lord and we commit our steps to Him. God does not call us to stride forward into the future with emotions or fueled by determination, but instead to do so with composure that's shaped by trust and delight and commitment. And when we place our steps into the Lord's hands, He quiets that smoldering heart inside of us that keeps us restless. He steadies our path that keeps us anxious. He replaces wandering with dwelling and urgency and peace. So this year, don't aim to simply do better. Aim to walk differently. Aim to walk differently. Commit your steps to the Lord. Let Him guide you where you go. Let Him govern how you respond to life and form in you a joy that does not depend on circumstances. That's how we stride forward into the new year. It's not frantic, it's not reactive, but we stride forward composed, settled, and at peace under the hand of the Lord.